So today we're going to talk about how to identify and eliminate bottlenecks holding your business back. Just to introduce myself and a little bit about me, I'm Amber Vogel, and I serve in a couple different capacities here at Eide. I help clients solve their business challenges, which may include things like developing a strategy around systems and processes. It may involve some process analysis and improvement, or sometimes it's just aligning the right systems to help solve those challenges. And on the other hand, I also have helped develop and am leading our shared services PMO. And just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of the background of my career over the last 17 years or so, I have been an advisory consultant. I've been an implementation consultant. I have built and led teams of project managers, business analysts, automation analysts. And so this topic today to me is really the sweet spot and the intersection of all of those things. It's where they come together to talk about something that I really enjoy, and that's continuous improvement. But our agenda today is going to be, we're going to lay the foundation a little bit and talk about creating a culture of continuous improvement. And then from there, we're going to dive in and talk specifically about one component of continuous improvement, and that's process review and analysis. And then we'll kind of dive over a little bit and talk about automation and when to consider it, what it means when you're doing process improvement. And then we'll round it out at the end with the benefits of doing all of these things. So I'm going to kick this off today and set the stage using this quote by Mark Twain. And I like it. Continuous improvement is better than delayed perfection, because I think we often strive towards the perfect way to do something. And with that mindset, we tend to either never get there, or it just takes a long time to get there. And if instead we make incremental improvements over time, we will realize progress much faster. And then the other side of this is that while we're working towards that perfect process or that perfect way to do something, what you often realize is that by the time you get there, you're already behind and you kind of need to reinvent again. So by making incremental improvements, you're really just keeping up and able to adapt to changes in your business or changes in your industry. So we're going to kick it off with our first poll question and ask you, do you think your organization promotes continuous improvement? Awesome. Yeah, that's a lot of yeses. So that is good to see. So I hope that what we're talking about today supports and encourages more of that here. So to start, I'm going to talk a little bit about what continuous improvement is, and then we'll dive into some of the components. So I think most of us, when you hear the word continuous improvement, we kind of get the gist of it. It's improvement that's never ending, right? You also may hear of it. It's more well known in the operations and manufacturing space, where organizations are doing things with Six Sigma, Lean Six Sigma, those type of methodologies. The context that I'm going to refer to it today is not related to any specific way on delivering continuous improvement. In my mind, I believe that it can be accomplished in many different ways. And sometimes we overcomplicate it by trying to fit it into a certain method or technique. Not that I'm saying discounting any of them, they're all very important. I think that I like to be able to adapt to the environment that I'm in, and that there are many ways to do that. So if we talk about, just think about the rudimentary definition of continuous improvement, it's really about seeking small improvements with the objective of increasing quality and reducing waste. So the components that I have up on the screen, there are, I'm sure, a million components of continuous improvement. And creating a culture that supports that. The ones that I picked out tend to be ones that are barriers or ones that I have seen go sideways. And so I want to just focus on a few of them today. And so the very first one, before I start here, I guess the culture part of this, right? So we not only have continuous improvement, but if we want to create a culture around that, that's a culture and an environment where your employees are encouraged to question and look for better ways to do their work. And so we kind of have to marry the two, the continuous improvement part with a culture that supports that activity. And so the 6 components I have on the screen, when we talk about strategy, people in the organization tend to want to participate, or they understand the importance of something when it comes from leadership. So making it a part of the organization strategy and incorporating into the language that we use and talk about is really critical in changing behavior. If we try to do this kind of change or set up this kind of culture in pockets of the organization, it tends to not get as much traction. And then we tend to look and say, well, these guys are doing this over here and these guys are doing this over there. It's better if it comes from our company strategy, and then we all buy into it being supported from there. And then when we look at it from a mindset perspective, a lot of employees in our companies have been taught to do their job or their work in a certain way. And it's not easy sometimes to put on that different hat and question why I'm doing it the way that I do and try to look for improvements. So when you have a culture that typically doesn't support that, it's a mindset shift. You know, we have to encourage you to just be looking at things and understand why I'm doing it that way. And then from an idea perspective, the theory is if we support that strategy and we have that mindset, that ideas are going to be of the plenty. And I think sometimes at the leadership and the management level, we think we know how things work and how processes flow. I'm a believer that the only people that really know how things work in our organization are the people closest to the work, the ones that are working on our processes. And so by asking them for their ideas, you know, we're just getting their buy-in, we're getting their support, and we're getting real information. You know, sure, you're going to get a lot of ideas that either, you know, are not good. We might know right off the bat, these aren't good ideas, or maybe it's not priority right now. But I don't know about you. I think I'd rather have a lot of ideas than no ideas. And then kind of building on that from a training and education perspective, in a culture that has not typically encouraged process improvement, it will be very important to train and educate employees on how they can do their part. So it's one thing for us to say from a company level, we're going to start trying to create this culture. We want you to shift your way of thinking and give us ideas. But how do they do that? So what should they be looking for? Who should they tell? How do they collaborate with their peers? There's education all around that that's going to help them be successful to support our strategy. And then change management is probably the biggest and most important part of any of this. People need to be a part of the change. Anytime we're looking for bottlenecks, we're doing process improvement, investigating the way we do things, we need to include the people that are doing the work. They need to understand why we're doing this, what's in it for them, and how is this going to impact what they do. People tend to, and naturally, when we start talking about process improvement and automation, their mind goes right to, I'm not going to have a job. I'm going to have to, you know, they're going to make me do things I don't know how to do. That's just how naturally people absorb information without knowing why we're doing it. So change management is very important here. And then from a priority and focus perspective, this is something where if you do all of those other things, we're going to have so many ideas and so many process improvement initiatives on the list to do. So one of the hardest parts is prioritizing what to work on and creating some focus to ensure that we do realize success in this adventure. So after talking about these components, it's kind of like, well, how often do we need to do this? Like, is this like, hey guys, we're going to create a continuous improvement culture and then we do this and then we're done? And the answer is no, it's never done. Continuous improvement never ends and is ongoing. And what I like about this graphic, the words are great in the graphic, but the arrows moving continuously over and over again is really the message here. We're going to identify processes that we need to improve. What are those bottlenecks? We're going to perform analysis on those processes. We're going to determine how we're going to move forward with our future process and what improvements we're going to make and how we're going to make them. We're going to make a decision on how we move forward and create a plan to implement those changes. And then we're going to measure the success of that work. And then we're going to do it all over again. And not that we're going to do it all over again like immediately, but the theory is that over time, this just becomes a part of the way we work. And we're always looking at how we do things and identifying, once you do a major process improvement and maybe re-engineer a process, looking at it from a continuous improvement perspective becomes easier because it's more the little things maybe that you're catching that you can change. All right, so moving on to process analysis. So process analysis is really a component of continuous improvement. It's that more tactical part of what you're going to change. And there are many parts before this where you're going to need to spend time determining what processes to review. There's probably some governance around the type of changes you can make and what you need approval for. Sometimes there's committees put together that monitor that and help facilitate that. Maybe it's the Center of Excellence that provides the framework for moving this forward. And then they put some guide rails around it and adds visibility into the work that we're doing. Today, we're going to assume that has all been done already. We could do a whole webinar on creating a center of excellence around process improvement. But for today, we're going to assume that's happened. We're going to assume we have a backlog of processes to review. And we're going to talk about a process review framework, which I really think is one of the first steps in understanding what our bottlenecks are. And so we have another polling question, and that is, does your organization have an approach that is used to analyze business processes? Ooh, a little bit of a mixed result there. Actually, more no's than yeses this time. So, all right, thanks for that. That helps us. Hopefully you learned some ways to put that process in place. So how to identify bottlenecks. I have a 3-step process that I use to gather the information I need and to put a plan together to improve processes, re-engineer processes. And these include first analyzing the current state, defining the future state, and then developing a change strategy that helps us get from one to the other. I like this process because it's simple. Now, there's a lot of things that go on in each of those buckets. It's really easy for us to overcomplicate how we approach process improvement. So I like to try to simplify it, keep it down to these few steps. And I can consider this to be more of a framework, if you will, in that the techniques and methods that you use in each of them are going to vary depending on your situation and the type of process that you're looking at. So we're going to break these down. We're going to talk a little bit about each of them. The first one's really analyzing the current state. And so I have a philosophy that you cannot change a process you do not know. And it seems very basic and simple, but you'd be surprised at how many times we either spend very little time here or we skip this step. And so on the slide, and each slide that we talk about for these, I've summarized some key activities and deliverables that are an outcome of analyzing the current process. Some of these things seem a little rudimentary and obvious to the exercise. But like I said, some organizations choose to skip this and move on to what the process should be. And I really like starting here and going through the work to do this because there can be a lot of different kinds of results that you realize out of analyzing the current state. Some of them include the obvious, identifying bottlenecks, right? By reviewing the current process, we're going to identify things that are holding us back. We're going to get a better understanding of the impact the process has on our customers, and whether those are internal customers or external customers. We're going to really understand the people side of the process. Maybe there's people constraints. Maybe there's too many people in the process. Or we may conclude with, we don't need to do this process anymore. So that's also a possibility. And depending on those results, it's going to drive how we move forward into the future state analysis. If we decide that we no longer need the process, we don't need to do the future state. So we're going to stop here. And the time that we spend here depends. There is no right or wrong answer for how long we're in this part of the framework. It's going to just depend on the complexity of the process. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You can spend 2 hours on a really small process and get a lot of good information here. Or if it's a really complicated process and it impacts a lot of different areas of our business, we might be here for months. So, I've been a part of many organizations that look at this exercise and think that we're spending too much time reviewing how it's done today and not enough time on how it should be done. And what happens if we either don't spend enough time here or we skip this step? When we get to the future state analysis, what happens is as we're developing the future state process, we start to uncover the things that we would uncover in analyzing the current state. And it causes this boomerang effect where I have to keep going back and forth. I have to go back and forth because I uncover something. I have to go back to the stakeholder and ask them. And then I come back and I start doing my future state, and then I have to go back. And what happens is oftentimes we don't uncover enough to know enough when we do that. And it's also, we lose trust with our stakeholders when we do that, because them knowing we didn't spend the time up front to learn what their process is and what they do is not going to set us up to be successful when we come and we want to change their process. So we get a lot of buy-in here, we get a lot of involvement, and it just helps later on when we're ready to change versus trying to skip ahead and recover when we're in that future state area. And to talk a little bit about the deliverables that come out of analyzing the current state, a lot of times it's process flow diagrams. We kind of map out what that process looks like. And depending on the needs of the business, I have kind of a reference to a level 0, 1, and 2 process map. And those levels really indicate the level of detail that you put into your process maps. Sometimes it doesn't require as much detail, so you can go with a lower level. And then usually there's some type of documentation around what the current environment looks like, what you learned, observations, and really what the business need is. And that's, that can take the form of many different things, whether it's a Word document, a PowerPoint, those types of things. And those will carry into the future state as we kind of design what we're going to do next. So before we move to future state, I put together just a few bullets on some process review guidelines. And I use these ones specifically because they're ones that often get missed or are barriers to process improvement. There's probably a whole book you can read on process review guidelines. And so I'm not saying that I have them all covered here by any stretch of the imagination. These are just specific ones I wanted to mention. And the first one's really about always reviewing the process from start to finish. And regardless of the part of the process that we know about, sometimes we try to hone in on a part of the process and say, this is where the problem is, let's look here. And a process is usually bigger than you think. And the part that we're focusing in on probably has impact on other parts of the process or people that contribute to the process. So start to finish to me means, where does it start? And it might not be with a particular team that you started with. And where does it end? And our customers might be involved in there somewhere. So we'll want to make sure we know where they're being impacted as well. And this one seems obvious as well, but sometimes it's not clear where the process starts. So if you think of an order entry process, like we know that there's a challenge with we've got a team that takes customer orders and they're entering them manually into a system. And that's the part we want to fix. That's not efficient. Well, when we're mapping out the process and understanding how the process flows, we should actually be starting with where the customer entered the order. And then we should probably be ending with where the order goes before it's fulfilled and what team's taking that order from that order entry team. And so that kind of ties into that next bullet there, is understanding who's using the information from the process, what are the inputs and what are the outputs. And if we make a change, are we going to be impacting someone else's process? I've actually been a part of this before where we've made a change and someone all of a sudden says, hey, I'm not getting my report anymore that I usually get every Wednesday. Well, we made a process improvement to the process before that report generating, and it no longer generates the report. We should have known that that report needed to go to that stakeholder, and we should have accounted for it in our process review. And then the last two just tend to be conversational barriers when you're talking to stakeholders about their processes. Never assume something cannot be improved or automated. Sometimes this is cultural, sometimes this is just my personal behavior. But when we come in and we're asking about processes, tell me how you do things, and they ask why, and it's because we want to improve it. I hear a lot of words like, well, you know, I talked to so-and-so about that a long time ago, and they said, we can't do anything about that, or we don't have that kind of system to make that change. And it's, you know, there's a lot of red flags and barriers being thrown up to basically make the point that you can't make this process better. It's the best it's going to be. So when I have those conversations with team members, I always try to set it up like, if you could dream and if there were no barriers and you could have this process work any way you want it to, what would it look like? Assume the company has the things that you want it to have, and kind of just eliminate those barriers up front so that you can have a really good brainstorming conversation with the stakeholders. And then when we look at the people in our organization that create some rules and put some controls in place around the processes that we perform, or maybe we have a compliance department or an audit department that has some say in how we do things, I don't let them be a barrier to the improvement. That's another thing that I hear a lot about is, well, this process is in place because compliance told me I have to do it this way, or audit told me that I have to do it this way. And what I like to do is I like to bring these teams into the process improvement process right at the beginning. Sometimes we like to skirt around them and ask for forgiveness later. Sometimes we just don't touch the process because we're afraid that we're going to have to go talk to these people. But what I've learned is that by including them early on and letting them know what you're doing, they're really passionate about the work and improving processes, because it's going to make things less risky for them if things are automated, if things are not manually entered. So I consider them to be our partners in this. And so setting the stage for that up front, bringing them in early, will just contribute to the success we have as we make changes. So let's move on and talk about the future state. So the future state, after we've done the current state, this is probably the hardest part, but it's also the most fun because you get to play a little bit and dream about what it could be. And that's probably why we try to skip the current state, because, you know, like, gosh, why do we want to dwell on the past? Let's focus on where we're going. We do need the past, though, to help support where we're going. So a couple of the things that makes this the hardest part is gaining consensus on how the new process should work. So before starting this phase, it's super important to clarify roles and responsibilities that during this exercise. Who has the authority to make decisions, or the final decision when we get there? There's always multiple ways to get things done. And sometimes we sit and spin here because we have so many players in the game, and, you know, we may have a technology resource that, you know, they're supporting it this way. We might have compliance over here saying, well, I'd like you to do this, and a management team saying, well, let's do it this way. You know, how do we come together and agree and make that ultimate decision, and who's going to help us do that? And then another thing that will probably be a part of the current state analysis and will support the future state, but if we didn't do that, and we need to do it here, is to state our objectives. You know, what are we looking to get out of this? Because our objectives will most often inform how we accomplish something. So things like, I want my clients to be able to review their orders online, or I want to reduce the number of people in this process. I want to reduce errors by X%, or let's eliminate paper from this process. Those types of things will drive us towards how we develop the future process. And then the other consideration I have in the future state development is about balancing the amount of detail that we put into this exercise. It's so easy to work through the current state in a great amount of detail because the process exists. We have all the information. We can do that there. In the future state, we don't know what it's going to be. We're spending time creating it, and it's very easy to get bogged down with things like, I want my client to get an email confirmation after they do an order. And that's probably all I need to know at this stage, versus I'm going to have X system create the email conversation, and it's going to be triggered off of this field, and it's going to be sent at this time. And, getting into the micro level is, if you try to do that on a very complex process, it's going to take a long time, and we're never going to make any progress. So if we high level map out where we're trying to get to, when we get to the change strategy, we're going to talk about some phases and how we can start to incrementally break those down and uncover more detail about where we're going. So we just need to be careful about how much time we spend here, because it's really easy to get into some analysis paralysis, if you will. All right, so the next one is developing that change strategy. So once we've looked at the current process, know what we want to do with it, then we have to figure out, how do we get from the current state to the future state? And so this is really where we're going to understand what we are going to do to change the process. We probably have a lot of that in the future state, but now we really need to get it down. And we do need a little bit more detail here. And depending on the complexity of the change, you may need a phased approach to get there. And that's really a good way to think about it, because sometimes process changes seem very daunting. And so if we can break it down into a phased approach, it's more manageable. And just to call this out, I've been in some organizations where we have a fear of phases. And sometimes that fear comes from, we tried to do phases and I never got past phase one. The team delivered on phase one, and then the company moved on to the next thing, which was something outside of my team. And so I never got to realize phase 2 and 3. So then from a cultural perspective, what happens is, when we're trying to develop phase 1, we cram everything into phase 1 because we're afraid we're never going to get phase 2. And then what happens is, now phase 1 is too big and it's very hard to accomplish. And so we just have to make sure we're held accountable to getting to those other phases, and that we're working towards that, and we have visibility into what else needs to be done. And I didn't talk about the deliverables on the future state. I just recognized, and the deliverables for the future state, if I back up a minute, are very similar to the current state, in that we'll have some future process flow diagrams. We're going to have some business requirements, and those things are very similar. We're also going to, I just want to look at that quick. One thing to call out on the future state, so I don't miss it, is it's also a good time to do internal and external research. And so what are other departments in the organization doing? Can we piggyback off on any of that? What are our competitors doing? What are others in our industry doing? Research is an important part of future state. And then just coming up with options as we come into the change strategy are super important as well. So coming back to the change strategy, the deliverables here are really, what are the gaps? We have to call out the gaps between the current state and the future state. And I like to break them down by people, process, and technology. No matter what type of process change you're doing, more often than not, there's some type of people component, whether it's changing the behavior of the person doing the process, whether it's introducing a new technology that they need to learn. We need to understand what those gaps are in moving to the future state from a people perspective. There's obviously process changes. We can outline those, and then a lot of times when we're doing process improvement, there's a technology component that comes into play, and we can outline those gaps as well. And then how do we recommend moving forward? And what's that plan to transition? What's the timeline? What are the phases? And then the last deliverable that I have is identifying some quick hits. And so there's always some low-hanging fruit when you do this. They're like, oh, I want to change that right now, or we could change that immediately. What are those quick hits that we could do right away to give us a sense of accomplishment, see progress immediately, and get us working right away as we move towards that phase one? So what are some techniques that we can use through these stages of process analysis? Again, how I look at process analysis in that three-step framework, I look at all of these methods and techniques as almost like a toolbox. I've been asked before, tell me how we should do process analysis, and I want it to be consistent. I always want to do it the same way so that our stakeholders know what to expect. And I think that's great. And I think that we can use that framework to do that. But I do think that we need to adapt to the process and the audience and the complexity. I think how we do it needs to be adapted to that. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And there are many techniques and many methods. I have some on the screen that I have used consistently, but there are a ton of different ways to do this. And so this is not a comprehensive list by any means. So from what I like to do up front, before I even start my current state analysis, is I like to determine how I'm going to gather information so that I can share that with the stakeholders. I think for this kind of process, we're going to do some interviews. Maybe if it involves our customers, we're going to do a focus group, or maybe we need to do some surveys because of the nature of the process and how big it is. So identify upfront how we're going to gather information. And then from a documentation perspective, we should try to identify upfront what we're going to use to communicate what we learned, whether that's a requirements document, process flow diagram, or maybe we're working with a department that has or uses a lot of acronyms. Anytime you start talking to people and they're throwing out letter combinations that you have no idea what they mean, that glossary is super important here. Especially later on when we bring other people in for the future state and the change strategy, they can kind of understand what all of those what that terminology means. And so how are we going to gather the information, and how are we going to document the work that we did are things that need to be considered, and using the right techniques for the right kind of analysis is also important. All right, we are going to talk a little bit about automation, and we are going to start with another poll question. And it is, what type of process automation does your organization use most frequently? Yep, I expected the use of software to be number one. Very little RPA, so we're going to touch on that today. Thank you, those are great answers. All right, so process automation, and I have on this slide, process automation versus robotic automation. So, and just to throw it out there, robotic process automation is process automation. I'm calling these two out because I want to talk about them separately. When we think of process automation, today, when you read articles and things like that and buzzwords around automation, it really goes to robotic process automation, or RPA. Is the acronym we use. But I don't want to discount other forms of process automation. Sometimes we look at a process and we know that it's broken and we just say, let's use RPA or let's do robotic process automation to fix it. And I really think that we should be looking at all of our options holistically on what we can use to automate the process, and it's not always RPA. So in the process automation bucket, I have things like use of software. You will be surprised at how many organizations still have a ton of paper and still have a ton of spreadsheets outside of systems. So the first place we usually look is, how can we use our software that we already have to replace some of those? And that's automation, where we're automating it using software. And then from an integrations perspective, this one's actually probably one of the most popular and has gained a lot of traction. I remember a long, long time ago where integrations were so hard to do, right? And it took a developer to try to make that work. And now we have a lot of middleware options where it's configurable and just makes it a lot easier for our systems to talk to each other. That's also process automation. And when we look at, I think the thing that I see the most is when somebody's creating reports, they're using data from multiple systems to create those reports. So a solution for that in an automation opportunity is let's create a data warehouse using data from those systems, and then let's create reports that are automated from that data. That's process automation. And then BPA or workflow. So BPA stands for business process automation. So there are sometimes workflow comes with a system you already have. There's a workflow feature, or there are systems that actually just do workflow. And so you can, if you're an organization that has a lot of approval processes, or you need to document the flow of information, there are workflow systems that can facilitate that. You can set them up to do that. And so in my mind, all of these things are still very valid ways to automate our processes. And so if you look at robotic process automation, to clarify for those that are not familiar with RPA, so that we don't actually have robots walking around doing things. There is that happening, right? Those types of robots do exist. But when we talk about robotic process automation, think of it as more of a virtual worker. So they have a laptop or a machine. They have a username and a login, just like your other employees do. And they're sitting there doing their work. They're just virtual and we can't see them. So that's the way that I like to think of them. It's almost like having someone else on the team that's doing a job. There's actually roles out there that I've seen where you can manage a team of robots because we still need to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. We have to make sure they're efficient. And when problems come up and they're not doing things the way that we want them to do, someone needs to support them. Someone needs to solve that. And so think of it just like anybody else on the team. And the way that robotic process automation is intended to work is really focusing on mimicking keystrokes and actions performed by an actual user. And so we configure and program the robot to do those clicks and to move the mouse around and do the work just like somebody else would. Sometimes what I've seen with RPA is that we can actually go too far and make it into its own mini application. And that's not the intent of it, but it's so easy to configure that we end up making a little mini software application, and it doesn't actually mimic the keystrokes of the user. It actually replaces the keystrokes. And so just something to think about, but I wanted to call out the difference between the two and just talk about, we're going to talk about a little bit when to consider one or the other. So my next slide talks about when to automate, and this is not specific to robotic process automation. This is specific to automation in general. What are some red flags or things that come up during process review that would cause me to say, gosh, I wonder if there's an automation opportunity here, whether it's the use of software, integrations, or any of those other things that are on the list. And this list also is not all encompassing. These are just things that came to my mind when I was thinking about what I would be looking for. And it's things like, is the process repetitive? Is it objective? Or do people not have to, think, well, I see this and this, so it must be that. There's no critical thinking involved. Is there a system available that could support the process? Do we have something already? Is there manual entry? Is there paper involved? There is still, even though we're in a remote work environment, there's still interoffice routing going on, or for those of us in the office, that's still happening. That should be a red flag to say, gosh, could we do some type of workflow around this? And when you have people double checking each other's work, that's another area where it's like, why are you double checking? And can we do that double check if we need to a different way? Or if we have processes that are really prone to a lot of errors and we have to redo them a lot, that's another thing that should cause us to consider automation. And of course, compliance requirements. The more we can be efficient, automate, and make things less risky, our compliance processes are only going to get better. So those are all kind of some process things to consider when thinking about automation, but there's also some other things around it that we need to be aware of, and things like strategy and governance. So having an approach and some guidelines that drive how we determine and perform automation. So it comes down to that future state analysis where you need to determine how you're going to do the process in the future. There's more than one ways to do automation. And I've been in a lot of situations where one person says we should do it like this, and another person says we should do it like that. And so having some guidelines and governance around helping you make those decisions, I think are super important. And also not having any strategy around it or governance can lead to inconsistencies and just a greater risk in the performance of the processes if we're just kind of doing things different ways across the organization. And I'm a firm believer that before we even think about automation, we need to review the process. We have to look at how it's working today. It's very easy to know that a process isn't working correctly and then say, oh, we're just going to automate it and do this with it. Well, let's dig into it. What is it actually doing? What's working in there? So I guess at the end of the day, do not automate bad processes, because you can, it's possible. And then through all of this, I have start small and realistic. When we start off on a continuous improvement journey and we do process improvement in our organization, we tend to get really excited. And that could cause us to look at our most complicated processes and say, we're going to tackle those first. And what happens is those usually require the most effort. They're going to take more time. It's going to be a longer time before we realize some success. And those types of processes really aren't a good place to get your feet wet. So I always say pick some processes that are no-brainers, very small, and maybe we only save a couple hours when we improve them or something like that, but just get some quick wins, prove the value, prove that we can do this and follow the framework. Because I think it'll just gain trust with our stakeholders if we do that. And then just like when we're reviewing our current state process and talking about changing our culture to a mindset of evaluating how you do your work, when we start talking about automation with our stakeholders, it triggers even a different part of their brain that's not necessarily about, gosh, I wonder what they're going to do with my process. It's like, oh my gosh, they're going to automate it. That means I'm not going to be doing this at all. So there's kind of two different places to start having these conversations about change, and just really let them know that it's not about replacing the work they do. It's really about helping them do more meaningful work and add more value. And then just, I'm giving you permission that incremental improvements are okay. So continuous improvements about incremental change. We really sometimes get stuck trying to boil the ocean, and it just limits our progress. And so automating, so say we do a current state analysis, we develop our future flow, and then we say, okay, we're going to go from here to there, and this is how we're going to do it. We can pick a particular part of that process and say, we're going to start here, and we're going to change this part. And that's okay. It's okay to start small, and we have to help our stakeholders understand why we're doing that, because sometimes they get frustrated and they're like, well, I want the whole thing automated. Why are you just doing a part of it? But it helps them actually learn more about the process and why we're doing it if we start small. The goal of automation is not always to remove human intervention. Sometimes even in automation, we still need people to facilitate parts of the process. So incremental change is okay. So coming back to specifically talking about robotic process automation, an exercise that I've used in the past to determine compatibility with robotic process automation is I had a bit of a checklist where prior to, while we were reviewing the process, we made this a part of our analysis, in that what are the things that would either raise red flags or tell us that maybe this process isn't the right process to, create a robot for. And they were things like process complexity, how many people are involved, how often does the process error out, what is the impact to our clients? Now, that doesn't always tell us that we shouldn't use RPA, but it should tell us we should be very cognizant while we're doing it that there's clients involved here. So we want to make sure that we don't impact them negatively. When's the last time this process changed is something you should ask yourself before putting RPA in place. And part of that tells us if it hasn't changed for 10 years, we should probably really look at the process. And sometimes we need to make improvements to the process before bringing RPA into the picture. And so that's that compatibility part. How do we make the process more compatible to be successful in an RPA environment? And how often does the process change? If this is a process where every month, because of a regulation or something, we need to make changes, that may not be a great process for RPA, because then we have to reconfigure the robot every time it changes, potentially, right? It's just something to think about. How much time does it take? What's the transaction volume? Is there documentation so we can learn more about it? These are just things that before we're talking about building a robot to mimic the process steps, what are the answers to all these questions, and should we move forward with it depending on the answers? All right, we are getting near the end here. We're going to round it out with what are the impacts of doing all these things and improving our processes and including our people in that process. And so I have a few different buckets here that I want to talk about, and there's lots of different benefits to process improvement. These ones I like the most. We tend to go to that third box right away, right? That's usually our motivator is performance related, but I like to kind of bring us back and start with, there's lots of benefits from an employee perspective. What I have seen and felt and heard in improving processes that our people become empowered. They really love being a part of the process, and they like to, people generally want to be more efficient in the work that they do. And so this just empowers them to keep focusing there. Creating that culture of continuous improvement and communicating and educating employees around that. There's a ton of benefit to doing that. And then at the end of the day, from an employee perspective, it's really going to direct them towards more critical thinking type functions that require decision making, human intelligence. A lot of people feel like they're not using the skills that they have because they're bogged down in work that doesn't add a lot of value. And then our customers, we want to make sure they're included in this too. They should be getting a lot of improvement or a lot of benefits out of our improvement, whether those are internal customers or external customers. All of this should be focused on really making that experience with the client better. I even encourage organizations, if you have the right kinds of relationships, you can ask your clients for feedback. Sometimes we are afraid to do that, and sometimes we think that we know our customers, but what a better way to create or build a relationship with our clients than ask them what their feedback is. And I think at the end of the day, that's really going to improve that quality of service if we do that. And then the performance side of things are all things that we hear a ton about when we're talking about improvement and eliminating bottlenecks. And that's, increasing productivity. We're going to build scale. We can do more with less people. Increasing consistency across the organization. Putting standards around process improvement and automation is going to be a huge benefit into how we do our work and how we look at how we do our work. And all of this should enhance those audit and compliance results that we talked about, and hopefully our processes have fewer errors by going through all of these exercises. So I'm going to end there, leave some time for questions, and just want to say thank you for all that have joined today to hear me talk about process improvement. It really is a passion of mine. So I'm open. I would love to connect with you on LinkedIn, or feel free to reach out if you want to have a conversation. I'm always here and love to do that. So thank you.